Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to take a close look at a condition that can really affect your vision, uveitis.
Yeah, it can be a real challenge to figure out what's causing it too.
Exactly. It's like a medical mystery. And luckily, we have a great journal article to guide us today. Um, Autoimmunity, autoinflammation, and infection in uveitis.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. It really gets into all the suspects, so to speak.
Right. So what are we waiting for? Let's dive in. First things first, can you give us a quick rundown on the anatomy here? I know the eye has this special barrier, right? The BRB.
Yeah, the blood retinal barrier. It's like, well, imagine a security system protecting the retina. That's the part of the eye that actually receives light and sends signals to your brain so you can see.
Okay, so the retina is like a VIP, and the BRB is the bodyguard.
Pretty much. The BRB makes sure only the right things get in and out, keeps out things that can cause trouble.
So where does uveitis fit into all of this?
Well, uveitis is basically inflammation, right? And that inflammation can happen in different parts of the eye. Sometimes it's outside that protected area, outside the BRB, like, the iris, the colorful part.
Yeah, of course.
Sometimes uveitis affects that. But other times it's inside the BRB's zone, which means it's affecting the retina itself.
And that seems like a pretty big distinction, right? Does it affect what's actually causing the inflammation?
Oh, absolutely. Location is a really important clue. For a long time, people thought non-infectious uveitis was an autoimmune disease.
Autoimmune meaning the body is attacking itself.
Exactly. Like in this case, the immune system is mistakenly attacking the eye tissues.
Kind of a friendly fire situation.
Yeah, you could say that. The problem is the evidence for that, specifically for uveitis, hasn't really been strong. Researchers have looked at things like lens protein and uveal pigment, thinking maybe those are the targets, but they haven't found a smoking gun, so to speak.
Interesting. So if it's not a clear case of autoimmunity, what else are we looking at?
Well, there's this model that scientists use called experimental autoimmune uveitis, or EAU. It's an animal model.
Okay.
And basically, they can trigger uveitis in animals by injecting them with certain retinal antigens. So at first glance, you'd think, okay, maybe that supports the autoimmunity theory.
Right, because you're basically triggering the immune system to attack. Right?
Yeah. But here's the thing. To get EAU to work, they have to use this component from tuberculosis bacteria. It's called mycobacterial extract.
Hold on. So even in this so-called autoimmune model, they need to use something from bacteria. What's going on there?
It's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? It sort of suggests that even when we think we're looking at autoimmunity, there might be infection playing a role behind the scenes.
So infection is our next suspect. I'm intrigued.
It's definitely worth considering. But there's another concept we need to talk about, too, autoinflammation.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
Yep.
What's the difference between autoinflammation and autoimmunity?
So think of it this way. Autoimmunity is like your immune system has a specific target, right? Like in uveitis, maybe it's those retinal antigens we talked about.
Okay.
But autoinflammation is more like a general alarm is going off in the immune system. It's not targeting a specific enemy. It's just causing widespread inflammation.
So it's less about mistaken identity and more about a system malfunction.
That's a great way to put it. And a lot of times, these malfunctions are actually caused by our genes. Researchers have found specific gene disorders linked to both autoinflammation and uveitis. These disorders mess with how the immune cells function, and that can lead to all this uncontrolled inflammation.
So it's like there's a glitch in the program of the immune cells.
Exactly. And one of the key players in all of this is something called the inflammasome.
The inflammasome. Okay, I'm making a note of that. What is it?
It's like, how do I explain this? It's like a master switch for inflammation. When it gets turned on, it sets off this whole chain reaction of inflammatory responses, and boom, you can end up with uveitis.
Okay, so we've got autoimmunity, where the immune system is targeting the eye, and we've got autoinflammation, where the whole system is just going haywire. But what about infection? We keep coming back to that mycobacterial extract in EAU. Is there something more to that?
I think that might be. We have to consider the possibility that infection is a bigger player than we initially thought.
Even if there's no obvious infection in the eye itself.
Right. What if there's something else going on somewhere else in the body that's triggering this?
That's a fascinating thought. We're going to need to dig into that more.
We definitely will. And there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to talk about. The gut microbiome.
Wait, hold on. The gut microbiome, you mean all those bacteria that live in our intestines? How could that possibly be related to uveitis?
I know, it sounds crazy, right? But the research is starting to show some pretty amazing connections. There's evidence that certain types of gut bacteria can actually protect against uveitis, while others might increase the risk.
Wow. So our gut bacteria could be influencing our chances of developing an eye disease.
It's looking more and more likely, and it really highlights how everything in the body is connected.
This is incredible. Autoimmunity, autoinflammation, infection, the gut microbiome. It's like a medical detective novel, and we're trying to solve the case of uveitis,
And like any good mystery, we're uncovering more questions than answers as we go.
for sure. But I'm loving this. I can't wait to see where this investigation takes us next.
Me too. And trust me, there are plenty more twists and turns to come. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think a good place to start is by looking at infection as a possible common thread, the thing that kicks off the whole cascade that leads to uveitis.
Instead of viewing them as separate things like, oh, it's autoimmunity or R, it's autoinflammation or R, it's infection, maybe it's more like all those things are part of the same process.
Yeah, exactly. It's not as simple as we used to think. And the article points to a good example of this. The way we induce EAU in those animal models, remember they use that mycobacterial extract from tuberculosis bacteria. Yeah, I remember that. That really made me wonder what was going on. But how does that relate to humans with uveitis? I mean, most people with uveitis don't have active tuberculosis, right?
Right, not everyone does, but tuberculosis is tricky. It can hang out in your system for a really long time, like years, hiding in your lungs or lymph nodes. And sometimes it can reactivate and cause a huge inflammatory response.
Oh, wow. So you're saying that even a past tuberculosis infection, maybe from years ago, could increase your risk of developing uveitis down the road?
It's definitely possible, and there's this particular type of uveitis, atypical serpiginous choroiditis, that often gets labeled as non-infectious, but studies show it can be linked to tuberculosis. It really makes you rethink how we classify uveitis in the first place.
Yeah, that's a good point. It makes you wonder if a lot of those so-called non-infectious cases actually have an infectious root somewhere that we're just not picking up on.
Exactly. And this is where the microbiome comes into play. Remember that connection we talked about?
You mean the bacteria in our gut? But I still don't really get how that could possibly be tied to inflammation in the eye. Those things seem so far apart.
I know, it seems strange. But think of it this way. Your gut microbiome has trillions of bacteria, right? And they're constantly interacting with your immune system. They actually help to train your immune system, teaching it how to respond to different threats.
Okay, so is the idea that maybe if your gut microbiome is out of whack, with too many of the harmful bacteria and not enough of the beneficial ones, it could make you more susceptible to developing uveitis?
That's what the research is pointing towards. And it's not just the gut. The article talks about how other infections, too, can play a role, even ones that don't seem to have anything to do with the eye at first glance.
Really? Like
Yeah.
what kind of infections are we talking about?
Well, for example, they mention Propionibacterium acnes, that bacteria that's linked to acne, and even herpes viruses. They think even if those infections aren't actively causing problems right now, they might leave behind these little remnants. Like, imagine these little bits of inflammation just waiting to be triggered.
So it's like these past infections are lying dormant, like sleeper cells, just waiting for the right signal to set off a chain reaction of inflammation in the eye.
Yeah. And the trigger could be anything from a change in your gut bacteria to stress or even a new infection. It's this super complex system, and we're only just starting to understand how it all works.
Wow, this is really mind-blowing. So we have these past infections, potentially from years ago, that can affect things. We have the gut bacteria playing a role, and then we have the immune system itself, which can be triggered by all of this. And of course, there's the blood-retinal barrier that we talked about earlier. Do we know what's causing the BRB to break down in uveitis? Is it the infections directly, or is it something else?
That's the million-dollar question. Researchers are still figuring that out. But one idea is that certain immune cells, like the T cells, sometimes they get a little overzealous and start attacking the BRB itself.
Wait, so the immune system could actually be attacking the BRB? Even though it's part of the eye? That's wild.
Yeah, it's like a case of mistaken identity. Another theory is that the BRB is basically collateral damage. It gets caught in the crossfire when there's inflammation happening nearby in the eye.
Right, so once the BRB is compromised, that allows all kinds of inflammatory cells to flood into the retina, and that's what ultimately causes the vision loss associated with uveitis.
Exactly. That BRB is so important for protecting the eye.
So just to recap here, because this is complicated, we have these infections possibly from years ago. We have the gut bacteria, we have the immune system, and they can all play a role in affecting the BRB and causing uveitis, like this whole network of things going on.
Yeah, it's a real web of interactions. And what's really exciting is that this new perspective could change how we treat uveitis in the future.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more about what kinds of treatments might be possible. So where do we go from here in terms of treating uveitis? If we're moving beyond the traditional treatments, what's next? This whole conversation has really made me think differently about things.
Yeah, it's definitely been eye-opening, pun intended. But seriously, this is a really exciting area of research. And you're right, if we start thinking about infection as the root cause in many cases, maybe we need to shift our focus away from just suppressing the immune system and look at addressing the root cause itself.
Right, that makes sense. So what would that actually look like? What kind of new treatments could we be talking about?
Well, one thing that's really promising is targeting the microbiome. What if we could figure out who's at high risk for developing uveitis based on their gut bacteria?
So almost like creating a microbiome fingerprint for uveitis.
Exactly. And then, based on that, we could start to use very targeted therapies, things like probiotics or even fecal transplants.
Fecal transplants for uveitis.
I know, it sounds a little out there. But they've had some incredible success using fecal transplants to treat other conditions that are linked to the microbiome.
I mean, if it works, it works. It's amazing to think that we could potentially manipulate those bacteria in our gut to prevent or even cure eye diseases. It's like a whole new world of medicine.
It really is, and that's just one example. We could also start looking at developing vaccines or antiviral therapies that target specific pathogens that are linked to uveitis.
So instead of just using the same treatments for everyone, we could start to tailor treatments to each individual based on what's causing their uveitis.
Exactly. That's the beauty of all this research. It's making us rethink uveitis and its causes, and hopefully it's going to lead to more effective and personalized treatments.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like we've only scratched the surface here, but it's really given me a lot to think about. Before we go, what's one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with? What's the key message here?
I think the biggest thing to remember is that how we understand uveitis is changing. Those old categories of, infectious, autoimmune, autoinflammatory, they're not so clear-cut anymore. We're starting to see that infection might be playing a much bigger role than we initially thought.
So we shouldn't get too focused on the labels.
Yeah.
And instead, we should be looking for those connections and underlying causes.
Exactly. We have to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Think about how the immune system, the microbiome, past infections, the blood-retinal barrier, they all fit together. This is opening up a whole new world of possibilities when it comes to how we prevent, diagnose, and treat uveitis.
I definitely see uveitis in a whole new light now.
Me too. It's amazing what you can learn when you really take the time to dive into a topic.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with us. I know I learned a ton. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to The Deep Dive. If you want to learn more about the research we talked about today, be sure to check out the show notes for links to the original article and some other resources. And until next time, keep exploring.